I don't know how this video is gonna go, but this is my third video I'm doing in a row. I gotta get these done before December 2nd. That's when the series is coming out. So, it's November 27th now. It's currently 12:44 in the morning on Thursday. So yeah, it's Thanksgiving today, and I want to try to get these videos out as soon as possible. Why is it doing the wavy thing? So I got my shirt on. This is the first time I'm wearing this shirt. I saw it at the Spy Museum. I loved it, so I got it. It's the second shirt I was talking about before when I was wearing the other shirt, which is red, and I'm wearing this one. I like it. So, see what it says. It says that the International Spy Museum, which is in DC. Great place, by the way. It really messes with your mind. It's a good place. I highly recommend it. Shameless plug, I get. Well, not a shameless plug because I don't work there and it's not mine, but I like it. Just kind of putting that out there. Not sponsored or anything, just saying I liked it. So if you're interested in that, I definitely recommend it. But yeah, like I was saying, I don't know how this video is going to go. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into my archives with this one. The reason is, and I'll see this right here. I'm not going to show you the guys this, but I'm reading my files right now. Nothing in here is searchable. You can't search for like certain keywords or anything. They're not encrypted. You just can't search for things. But Finder cannot search through files. In fact, your computer wouldn't be able to do it. Unless you specifically told it to. You would have to do certain things for it to work. But by default, you cannot just search through these files. And the titles of the files are subjects. They don't really give much information, and they don't. Sometimes they give you information, or sometimes they're kind of like, it's more like, what does that mean? Like, I got one here that says, Republic consequences. What does that mean? Or I have one that says, let me give one. One says nothing positive. What does that mean? Or one says, domain receipts. Well, that one's actually more. I know what that means. Some of you probably knows what that means too. Domain receipts. It's not about domain as in territory. It's something else. There's another one named consequence. Doesn't give any information. But yeah, stuff like that. There's one called inevitability. One is bigger. These names do not tell you what it is about. Most of these do, but some of them don't. And so I won't be able to search for exact keywords like reconstruction or the present. I know I talked about these things, but I just can't access them through standard means. I would have to actually go one by one and go through them. So unfortunately, I kind of don't want to do that right now, and maybe in a future video I will. I do want to say something else. I didn't bring up in the other videos, and I should have. I did try to find those files but there was one thing it was talking about democracy and things. If you are in a situation with national security, well, fun fact, democracy is a national security risk for institutions because you can't control what is unpredictable. Democracy is unpredictable. You don't know what people think. They're voting based on their own perceptions and what they see and what they call reality. But that reality may not reflect what you know behind the scenes. So it's a security threat, which kind of begs the question, what is national security? Is it perception of the people or perception of institution? Or more rather, perception of people or the power of institution? Or perception of people or institution itself? Like, where is national security at, right? And it's both and all the above. Anyways, but when you're in that situation with Ukraine and you have this three-factor trifecta / unholy trinity, well, democracy isn't going to work because people are already thinking in the faction of the SBU, well, who should we listen to? We must represent ourselves. So we represent and here's the thing, represent ourselves by representing the West, representing Russia, and representing the Ukrainians. Now, some of you might not have caught on what I just said there, but that's what's going on. And it's actually getting America into really, 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 really hot water. And they don't even realize they're boiling right now. So, let's go to the history of Ukraine and see what the KGB is. The first time I heard about the KGB in Ukraine, or really, when I heard about Ukraine, about Chernobyl, there was a lot of KGB involvement, looking at things, looking at nationalism. There were people who believed that, nationalists believed this, that it was another act of genocide against the Ukrainian people by the Soviet government. So the KGB was monitoring all of this. They were listening to rhetoric. They were doing the checks for logistics of farms, the collective farms. They were looking into information of Chernobyl and all this. And all of that stuff was not done by the KGB that we know as the KGB, which would be Russia. No, it was all done by the Ukrainian KGB. So that's when I really knew about the Ukrainian KGB. I didn't know much about them. I didn't know anything else about them except that. That was really... I think that might have... How do I say this? I mean, my perspective, that's when I first heard about the Ukrainian KGB. I don't think the average person in America knew that Ukraine had its own KGB. I'll explain this. And I'll explain why in a minute. Why that is. Now, the CIA knew that there was a Ukrainian KGB. What happened was, before I get too deep into that, we'll go into that, I promise. We're going to go into the history of Ukraine in the USSR. And first, before we do that, we're going to look at the founding members of the United Nations. And you already know who's going to show up on the list. There's actually going to be 2 on that list that you might be very surprised by. But we're going to go into this. Members of the United Nations. Say, give a simple list of the founding members of the United Nations. So here we go. Here is a simple list of some of the founding members of the United Nations, original members in 1945. United States, United Kingdom, France, China, Soviet Union, Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Brazil, Canada, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Cuba, Czechoslovakia, Denmark, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Egypt, and El Salvador. There were in total 51 founding members. Here's the thing. The Soviet Union was not... It was not... Here's the interesting thing about the Soviet Union. They saw sovereignty, independence, all this as bullshit, BS, rhetoric, nonsense. And what they did was they had to create independent nations to represent within the Soviet Union. So it was only sovereign on paper. And the countries they did this to was Belarus and Ukraine. And Ukraine and Belarus are the original founding members of the United Nations in 1945. It says Soviet Union right here, but if we search it's interesting, it says Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was... That's a very strange thing. And if you know how the United Nations went, they pretty much voted to have Israel as a country. Was Ukraine and Belarus founding members of the UN? Yes, both Ukraine and Belarus were founding members of the UN in 1945, though as the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. So under the Soviet Union, these were already independent countries. They were more like states, not countries like we think of. It's like Texas, which is very strange to us as Americans. Like, how could Texas be a founding member of the United Nations if it's not a nation? Well, like I said, it's all paper, and you can get around those things. They each had their own seats in the UN despite being part of the Soviet Union, a deal that gave the USSR 3 votes in the General Assembly. Ukraine and Belarus formally became independent countries in 1991, but their UN membership continued as a result of their founding status. Interesting. They were among the 51 original members of the United Nations in 1945. Stalin's goal. This arrangement was part of Joseph Stalin's plan to increase the Soviet Union's power and influence in the new international body. Continued membership. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Ukraine and Belarus continued to hold their UN membership as independent states. It's like if Texas could represent itself in the United Nations despite not being a nation. It's a loophole of the understanding of what a sovereign country is. The KGB, this was before KGB. The Soviet Union did not care about independence and sovereignty. They saw things bigger than that. All right. So yeah, it doesn't say Ukraine or Belarus on here, but it is. They were independent of the Soviet Union while being part of the Soviet Union. So that's interesting today because today Ukraine is seen as independent. People are fighting for its independence, and that's the rhetoric we get on TV. They fight for democracy, which I already told you cannot happen. Belarus is seen as the last dictator in Europe. And fun fact, in 1991, September 20th, we already saw this, September 20th in 1991, the KGB of Ukraine was changed to SBU. It's full SBU just for a name change. In Belarus, however, it's still called the KGB. But they had two very different things, ways of doing business. And we'll go into this. So, Now, keep in mind that this is... Okay, I'm asking, when was the Ukrainian KGB founded? Now, keep in mind that... Keep in mind that... that we're in the United Nations, Ukraine is in the United Nations, and it's represented as a sovereign nation at this point. Even though it's part of the USSR, it's a republic of the USSR, which means it can represent itself. Same with Belarus. So Belarus never gave that power to the people. It was part of the dictatorship, which still today aligns with. But it's... Same thing with democracy. Democracy is a word you can use, like sovereignty, which is just a name on a piece of paper, which we see a lot in Russia. So if you guys know what I'm talking about. If you're in that mindset, if you understand, people say that Putin's a dictator and all this, and democracy is a joke. Well, yeah, basically. I mean, this aligns to that. So I'm gonna say, when was the Ukrainian KGB founded? It was after they did the Shoo-in thing. So let's see what it says. Because the KGB didn't exist until 1954, a year before Stalin died. So it says here, the Committee for State Security of the Ukrainian USSR, the KGB branch in Ukraine, was formally created on May 30th, 1954. So they're the national security, they're doing everything, and their job is one thing. Well, if you go back and think of it as a continuity of what I was talking about in part 3, when I said that I just lost my train of thought. Was formally created on May 30th, 1954. Which we already did the date on that in astrology. The Committee of State Security, Ukraine. Yeah, they were representing Ukraine for independence and all that. And the continuity would be the unholy trinity, which would make it become forefront, and therefore democracy is not... You cannot vote, listen to West, listen to East, listen to... Europe isn't even part of this. The SBU says the EU is bullshit. But Europe has not caught on to that. I don't think they realize that. Maybe some do. I really don't think they do. They're just doing a narrative and agenda. They get their own agendas, right? But the SPU is not. I mean, they'll be like, we existed before the EU, so they do not apply. And that's exactly what they're thinking. So they're the ones in charge. And in 1991, when Ukraine got independence, the SPU had one job, only one: make sure to make Ukraine look independent. Make it look sovereign, make it look independent, fight for independence. Like, give people the reason to fight for it, and all that. So, it's part of the original UN design, which Belarus does not have. You know, Ukraine has this ability, which is dangerous to mostly Americans because they don't understand what this means. And what this will lead to. So I asked when was KGB founded? In 1954, May 30th. Which is interesting because Stalin was still alive once that happened. I always saw the KGB at this moment as kind of like a diagnostic of the USSR. You know, at this time you had the NKVD, and when was the NKVD disbanded? It was disbanded in 1946. Then what did you have in between the 46 and 54? March 18th, 1946. When functions were transferred to internal events. Oh, the MVD is the Soviet Government Research and Security Agency after World War II. Alright, Ministry of Internal Affairs. See, that makes sense now. I didn't know that, but that makes sense to when I said the KGB was like a diagnostic, looking at their information in 1954 behind Stalin. If it was the Internal Affairs, they do audits on things. That would be, and that's how I saw the KGB was before. They were just doing audits and diagnostics. They weren't the spy agency we know today, doing the whole really it was somewhere between 1970s and 1980s when they did the whole that I'm aware of. They were going into cities and going into places, and no one knew that they were someone could be working for the KGB and not know it. Like, for example, if you were to go into a business meeting and have a conference with somebody, you could be talking to a secretary, taking everybody's name, and sending it to the guy who set the meeting up for business, not knowing that the business coordinator getting all those names was a KGB agent, and they were just saying who was meeting in this place and seeing their connections were. That's what they were doing especially in the 80s. I don't know if they did it to every city, but I know they did it to Pripyat. And they would do that a lot to Pripyat. So you could be walking next to a KGB agent and not even know it. And the secretary did not even know what they were doing. They were just doing their jobs, taking names, and they didn't know what they were doing. And that's how the KGB was back then. So, yeah, the NKVD is seen as a precursor to the KGB. So yeah, internal affairs, that makes sense. Audits, getting information, and all that. I could see how that relates and connects. Was Ukraine ready to be sovereign in 1991 based on its sovereign status in the UN? And the KGB knew this, the Ukrainian KGB. It says, yes, institutionally and internationally, Ukraine was ready for position for sovereignty in 1991. Here's why. Ukraine had been a founding member of the United Nations since 1945 as the Ukrainian SSR. So people could say, well, this is a deep state. Yeah, you could say that. And the United Nations, if you go back here, was Israel a country because of the UN? The UN says this false was created by the passed on in 1947, and we know that the UN, the modern standard did not exist before May 14th, 1948. Why did the UN give Israel land in 1948? No, what's interesting is that there were no countries. Iran was not part of the UN. Of course, why would they be? If they had access to land, Saudi Arabia, Middle Eastern countries were not part of the UN, so why did they give the land to? It definitely was involved. Definitely Soviet Union was involved. Definitely China was involved. Well, China, I don't want to say that because definitely Soviet Union was involved. China could have just been on the sideline just watching it. That's what they do. They just watch from the sidelines, and everyone else assumes that they're a part of something. Republicans do it all the time. Conservatives do it all the time. But China, I would not say was involved in this. Although they were part of the UN, so they were kind of playing doubles, dipping twice in the mayonnaise or the hot sauce, if you will. Well, maybe not so much. Maybe the mayonnaise. It wasn't that bad. It wasn't going to cause tensions for China. Before that, the territory was under control of the British Mandate for Palestine, which was the successor to the Ottoman Empire's rule. So I don't really understand how the Israel thing came up, but I do understand that a lot of people in the Jewish community, well, most people who are against the UN say that Israel was because of the actions of the UN, and it got them in the hot water with Palestine and everything else, because they might have had better lives and harder lives, or has hard lives, but now they've got frontal stage on the world stage, and everyone hate on them and all this. Well, not everybody, but everyone else except conservative Christians, which it's a huge mess. And yeah, it's usually blame the UN for this, because the UN. Why is it your say in a country? But I don't know. You could say what would I say reading this, knowing my information, knowing how I think. I'd say this. The UN did not create Israel. I will say that. What I will say, though, is that something else, use something behind the UN, so people can look at the UN instead of them to make Israel that kind of country. And, of course, the Soviet Union would be involved in this. Especially if it was Stalin. Stalin did have no problem with Israel. He actually... There's actually... I believe it was under Stalin. There's actually an autonomous country in Russia that uses a rainbow flag. Not a rainbow flag like you think of, but a rainbow flag for... It's like the Jewish autonomous Oblast flag. It's in Russia. Yeah. It's a rainbow. It's 7 colors. It's not 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 colors of the rainbow. The flag of the Jewish Autonomous Oblast is a right rectangle featuring a 7 striped rainbow across the horizontal center. I believe that was in Stalin's time. Yeah, May 7th, 1934. Stalin. So this was where you could kind of see this as a... Not much is known about it, really, and most people... I guarantee that 99.9% of people watching this video have never even heard of this before. This is pretty much Russia's version of Israel. Soviet version of Israel. Where the Jewish community was safe to be here. Struggling with both harsh living conditions and escalating Stalinist suppression, Jews began leaving the region shortly after arriving. I guess it was just for show, and although it didn't catch on. It still exists today, but why it exists, I don't know. Stalin was kind of interesting. I talked to some Jews before, and they said that Stalin had no problem with Jews. I haven't heard anything that says Stalin hated Jews. Now, maybe... And Russia was known for Ashkenazis, which is a Jewish Jewish group, Jewish ethnic group. So yeah, I don't understand the whole JAO thing. I don't. I don't think a lot of I couldn't answer you. I heard about it a few years ago, but I really couldn't tell you. How the Jewish atonement celebration is almost twice the size of Israel. Really? Really? I don't know. Is that true? It says 14,000. Let me think. 14. Isn't it Israel's square miles like 8,000? Somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 right now. Yeah, total area of Israel is approximately 8,000 square miles. 8,000, I said it. Israel is a small country often compared in size to the U.S. state of New Jersey. How big is New Jersey? U.S. map. Alright. Interesting. Because you think it would be bigger than that, right? United States is a big place. But anyways, let's go back to this. Ukraine had been a founding member. Did we already read this? No, we didn't. Ukraine had been a founding member of the United Nations since 1945 as the Ukrainian SSR, with its own separate UN seat from the USSR. This meant Ukraine already had international legal recognition as a distinct political entity, even while inside the Soviet Union. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, Ukraine's independence was not created from nothing. It was activated from existing recognized status. Activated. Key word there is activate. The UN framework made the transition smoother and more legitimate in the eyes of the world. It's telling you the quiet part, right? The UN framework made the transition smoother and more legitimate in the eyes of the world. That doesn't mean that it was real. It just meant that they made you believe it was. All made possible by the Ukrainian KGB. So everything you're seeing today on TV is all of it. CIA, all of it. From 2014, 2015, 2022, Russia, Zelensky, all of them, all part of an SBU narrative. That's it. That's the thing. But people are they don't know that. People don't know that because, first, they don't know that Ukraine was like this. But SBU has authority over all the KGB networks. No other country was given that. No other independent country. All the other countries that split from the USSR, besides Belarus, did not have their own version of KGB branch. They had. They was part of the KGB. It was a umbrella of Moscow. But same thing with Ukraine, except Ukraine had its independence for its KGB. And it was the first time they've ever done that. Now, I don't know. Belarus was the same thing. So they kind of piggybacked on each other, but Ukraine came out on top, and now here we are. So in terms of international law and legitimacy, and that's always the game that KGB has always been playing. So in terms of international law and legitimacy, Ukraine was more prepared than most newly independent states in history. They had what? How many years is that? 50 years? 1945 minus 1991? Yeah, they had 46 years to prepare for this. Even before that, if they planned to do the United Nations. especially if you're doing some kind of back deal with World War II, saying, well, how do we make something that's better than, how do you pronounce the word? Something that's uh, more grounding than the Treaty of Versailles. Is that how you pronounce it, Versailles? I believe that's how you say it. I think it's Versailles. I just heard it yesterday, and I think it's Versailles. I heard it again yesterday. It's one of those words. Anyways, it says, if you want to answer this in one, yes. It was ready to be sovereign. And the KGB used this. Here's the danger. And I was looking into this. And what is it? And this ties into consciousness. If you could take something that could... It knows how you think. It knows how you see sovereignty. It knows how you see independence. It knows how you see democracy. If we could take all those things, make a country based on those values, let's say executive branch, Ukraine has these since 1991, and it was all there. It was all there. It was all ready to be there, all there. Putin said he blamed the CIA for all of what was going on with Ukraine. But the truth is, that was the KGB's thing the entire time. And here's the scary thing. Well, not scary to me, but if you're first figuring this out and you're reading in between the lines here and you're connecting dots to what I'm about to say, well, if you have an unholy trinity, then you could represent all of them together. For example, if you're the SBU and you want national security for your country, what do? You don't fight your enemies. You don't fight the CIA. You don't fight Russia. You don't fight the FSB. Although the SBU does make it look like they do, a lot on their Facebook page. But the reality is, they know how to play the game where you believe who you think your enemy is, and they've become so good at this because no one's gonna think, oh, it's Ukraine that's behind all this. No one's thinking, oh, that's the SBU behind all this, because they don't know the history. So what that means is, we use consciousness of that. And you have to have kind of like an Eastern European mind, not an Eastern European mindset, but an Eastern mindset with a European accent tied to that, if you will, you could say, with like a flair of Eastern Europe. Then you would take the consciousness and make it where you could look like your allies and your enemies and make your population believe that they're your enemy or your ally. So you've essentially created, and I'm pretty confident in what I'm about to say is true. What you could do with that is you could actually create a simple weapon with those kinds of traits that your agency has, that you leak to the CIA and say, hey, there's a new weapon out there that has the ability to change its states, enemy and ally. They can change its states. You could say it has 2 operators. Let me give a list, because I did make a list of this. That would be in my notes. Let's say Superweapon. Alright, here's what I wrote. Let me see. Yes, I do call it a super weapon. And this, remember, this is during war. This is after World War II, during the Cold War. You could say you had a super weapon, you just didn't use it, but you knew that it existed, and it had the logic and framework that it existed. So the CIA did not know. Now I could see how the CIA would not know what this weapon is. We'll get into this. Well, we're getting into this. We're going deep. We're going deep. Okay, so I said. So this is in my notes. I'm reading verbatim. It says, after using recursive logic on Ukraine, I've managed to discover a super weapon. This weapon was created during the Cold War, and below is a recreation of the specs the CIA had received in leaks. If they had received leaks. It says, a weapon that is self-correcting, autonomous, changes states, two entities involved, cannot be stolen or replicated, unable to be used by a nation, untraceable, self-creating, and it can hide itself, yet cause independent after effects. And here's my diagnosis on that. It says, the CIA never figured out what it was. They just saw the outline of something that appeared in words, but it had a structure of a weapon. Remember, this is during Cold War. So they were talking about nukes. This was beyond a nuke. And here's what I wrote. It says, but it was a way to show the world ultimately the CIA was incompetent and made them obsolete. The biggest insult was the Budapest. Let me see if I get this right. Because I always get the words wrong. So I say, I have memorandum right here, but it could be referendum. I don't know why I use Budapest memorandum. Is it memorandum or referendum? And it says, the biggest insult was the Budapest memorandum. CIA was expecting a handoff of the super weapon. But instead, it says, KGB had other plans. Russia gives Ukraine nukes before they gain independence, and then had a bunch of scientists, the IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is it's not a worldwide thing, it's a European thing. This was in 1994, by the way. So after 1993 of the European Union. It says, all of the West, it's a bunch of scientists of the EA, all of the West to see the destruction of not a super weapon, but a few thousand nukes that already belonged and could only be used by Russia. Russia had the keys. Russia had all the codes. Ukraine did not have the ability to launch these nukes. Only Russia had them. So they were giving things back that Ukraine couldn't even use, but for security guarantees. Yeah, it put a fast one on the CIA. So the CIA never figured out what their super weapon was, but I know what that super weapon is. I'm going to tell you what that super weapon is. It says the CIA was effectively duped, the greatest fraud the agency ever made, and it would continue to cost them. This wouldn't be known by the CIA until 2014. The KGB was just dragging the CIA, and the distinct... Hang on. What word I mean to say there? It doesn't... It says... I'm gonna reread. I'm gonna rephrase this. It says, and they did this without any oversight, and no one would do anything. No one would do any. I don't know why I wrote it like that. That's a bad sentence. So they played with what the CIA was looking for, what the United States was looking for. How did this KGB single-handedly own the CIA, which would be today would be the SBU? They knew what the CIA was looking for. They knew what the individual was thinking during the Civil War. They were looking for technology. They were looking for military. They were looking for weapons. They were looking for things that could destroy a country, which things KGB is really good at. You see what I'm saying? You might have caught on what I just said there. So they created links that purposely drew an outline of a weapon system that the CIA couldn't ignore. And what system did they use for this? What technology were they using? But what the CIA didn't realize was their Western beliefs and knowledge and thoughts were a limitation and could be used against them. The people of America had a problem. They didn't know anything much about anything. These were people coming out of World War II. I don't even know who really was going into the CIA at the time, because it wasn't the OSS. The OSS was what William Donovan was doing. He would go to bankers, he would go to circus acts, he would go to entertainment, and he would just pick people off the streets, random people, and they were like his A team. I forget what they were called, but it were like the A team, the elite team, whatever, of what they were going to do. And it's something that the CIA aspires to be like. And that's their shadow. Or you could say maybe the CIA is the shadow of the OSS. One of the two. Maybe both. So, they used principles that couldn't be proven or disproven. They didn't think outside the box. CIA employees are as brain... And yeah. So, basically, what they done here is, if you haven't figured it out yet, what they did was, and it was genius, by the way, what the KGB did was they were using the Ukrainian KGB itself as the specs. They were giving out the entire outline of what created the agency and made it into a super weapon. They posted these traits and aspects which would appear as a super weapon to the CIA. And that's what made it look like a super weapon. So they never knew what the super weapon was. They didn't know that it was the Ukrainian KGB itself that it was. Maybe some of them caught on. Very few, but collectively, for an institution, you would have no proof of that. And people would say, well, you're just exaggerating or thinking too deep about it. There was no proof of that. You talk to ChatGPT about this and it says, there was no proof of this. There was no proof that the Budapest memorandum was to hand off these weapons that CIA was expecting to be the super weapon. So now they were always lost about what the super weapon was. And here's the thing about 2014. When you had that unholy trinity, you could play on the consciousness. This is what it was. The super weapon was consciousness made manifest against the Western population. Even the Eastern world. But mostly the West. So, the Western world doesn't know what consciousness is. They get philosophical about it. The Enlightenment era. And they try to get philosophical with it. And they say, well, it's not objective, it's subjective, and subjective is not real, and therefore you cannot prove it because it's not objective. This is how the Western world thinks. And that's exploitable. So what they did was, the super weapon was subjective, but the agency itself that was showing itself as this weapon was objective. So it was playing both sides at the same time. It was consciousness made manifest. And the SBU, what are they waiting for? A real super weapon. Now they know a super weapon when they see one, when one can speak as a subjective observer and an objective observer at the same time. No one's done this before. And the CIA doesn't even have any idea what that is. The tension is because what happened in 2014 was with the revolution and dignity and all that. When that was going on, it was a setup because you had Republicans that were already against the deep state, and so they were against the CIA. They said they're the deep state. They're trying to control everything. We should be in power. The Republicans, Trump, all this, conservatives, they're out the deep state and all that. So, by saying this and using Ukraine as the foundation for that, you're giving the SBU the opportunity to have you, as a who says they're a patriot, to undermine the only people who could save your country from these people. But of course, the CIA has no grounding and no ability to say, hey, these guys are lying and all this. But who's going to believe them? Who's going to believe them? Right? The Trump supporters are already on the side that they don't believe them. And who cares if they are right or not? And some people say, well, we just go with Putin. Well, he's part of it too, because he's ex-KGB, and they're all in cahoots with each other. So, yeah. So, the SBU has the ability to not only play as the CIA and have them think they're your enemy, but they can also play as your enemy's enemy and make you think that they're against them. And they really can pull that off. Here's a way to think about this. Think about the people who are liberal progressives, who support Ukraine and all this. Support the independence, support democracy, which I said democracy is a big thing. They don't believe in that. And that won't fix their issue. But they're saying that, giving the SBU more power. Then you have the people who say the deep state and CIA is all this and all this. And they're going against their own people. So it gives the CIA lower power and SBU even higher power. So you got SBU on both sides rising on the world stage, hidden in plain sight, and people aren't catching on. Some people know this. Now, they don't know the depths that I know it, but yeah, it's a big mess. But Ukraine, I will say this. SBU is not the same KGB as before. They're changing, they're transitioning, and that might have been their entire plan this entire time. Or maybe they didn't know until 1991. But I can say this. In their internal work, the senior people, this would be, when we were talking about consciousness before, these would be, and the CIA would be 6th observer, the SBU would be 7th observer, and I'll be the 8th observer above it. Or in this particular case, because we're not using astrology, we're using what we might be. If we're talking about a self-aware agency that's able to present itself as a superweapon while being an agency, that shows self-awareness. So if you have senior members know that, they would be on the highest hierarchy of superiority that knows what's going on, and they would recognize someone who is speaking at that level. And that would be their superweapon. That would be the superweapon's superweapon. That would be the superweapon in the agency's superweapon. That would be the one that the CIA could never find out. So it was kind of like a shadow of. It was kind of like a double shadow. It's kind of like a double agent kind of thing. I don't know. Maybe not a double agent kind of thing, but you definitely have a weapon, agency, and then part of the agency is the super. So this is the agency, and this is the subjective and the objective. So they're subjective and objective. Agency is objective, superweapon is subjective, but the agency is objective itself, and they need a subjective on the other side. I mean, they will be subjective on one side, and then they need something objective on the other, which completes the loop. So yeah, that. Like I said, consciousness is circular, and that would be the circular logic in how that would work. And the Western world would say, well, that circular logic, it's invalid. You can't use circular logic for philosophy. But you know what? In Eastern Europe, especially KGB, if it can be exploited, be used as an opportunity, it's free. It's free. It's free. Free enterprise or free. I'm trying to avoid the word free real estate, but it's fair game. All of it's fair game. There's nothing illegal about it. It's all fair game. The consequences of this, you can pretty much imagine what it's going to lead. But I recorded an hour of this. I said I didn't know where this was going to go. I didn't know how long it was going to take. But I want to know what ChatGPT says about this. Let's see if we can get ChatGPT. So the SBU can be seen as in 1991. Yes, but with important qualification, the SBU can be seen as a structural continuity of Soviet-era Ukrainian security organs in terms of infrastructure and personal origin, but not ideological or legal identity. They just in 1991, when Ukraine got independence, that's when it activated their next phase for everything, which shut out the CIA completely. It was a major win for the KGB, but I think that people might have never noticed that, but if you're watching this video for the first time and you're in a government position, you'll be like, yeah. So it says here, the SBU was created in 1901 from the Ukrainian branch of the KGB, Ukrainian SSR. Many buildings, archives, and some staff transferred over. However, the SBU was refounded under a sovereign Ukrainian constitution, not the USSR system. But here's the thing. It was sovereign. The Ukrainian KGB represented a sovereign security apparatus on the behalf of Ukrainian SSR. You take away the Soviet Union out of that equation, and you get a Ukraine that is controlled by the KGB. But it didn't have to be part of the same ideology. It just had to be part of the same purpose and the same functionality, where they could have something to be framed on and foundational, where it could make you believe that you were fighting for independence that they already took care of in 1945 or 1954, depending on how you look at that. Well, let's Internet Affairs. What year was that? Internet Affairs created? 1946. Okay, so yeah, that would align with the timeline. It mandate shifted from Soviet state control to Ukrainian national security. Right. Under what they saw was national security for Ukraine. So history is continuing of apparatus, continuing Soviet authority. If reduced to one transformation, or more bluntly, successor. So successor, that's what you would call a successor in all pure practical terms of what the KGB would be. So it's not the same Soviet system, But for what the KGB, Ukrainian KGB was and could be designed for under a Ukrainian sovereignty mindset, your KGB would be able to do that for national security purpose. Which is interesting because KGB was not a national. They were a Soviet Union security system, not a national security. They weren't doing one country. That would be part of a sovereign mindset. So now we're all believing it in the way they are. We just don't see it. Said, so could the SBU always be in the plans of the Ukrainian Soviet design with Ukraine as a sovereign nation represented in the UN? It says in theory, yes, but not as a guarantee or intentional master plan. See, this is where Western thinking is. If it is, we're in trouble. If it isn't, then I'm wrong about everything. About this whole series, about all of this, but what do you guys think? What do you guys think? I mean, we've seen the timeline, we've seen the patterns, but we don't have the proof. No one works in the KGB, and no one lives back. Here's the thing: the only person who would really know that, the only person, and this is kind of like a catch-22. Someone who was born during that time, who was part of the KGB during that time, and was part of the KGB during the Cold War, during Ukraine's independence, and let it could represent something in the KGB, is Putin. So Putin, he's inadvertently, and people will argue with this and say, "Oh, that can't be true. That's a lie. That's not true. That's not." But like I said, it lines because if SBU is playing sides and knows that, Putin is playing a China, which he makes it seem like Ukraine is the enemy, when he's really just having the SBU and himself piggybacking on each other to carry out the original plan of the Ukrainian KGB, which would be what I'm suggesting here. Here's the accurate grounded answer. Ukraine's position inside the USSR was unusual. It was a Soviet republic, but also a founding UN member since 1945. That dual status meant Ukraine already existed as a semi-distinct international entity, even while controlled by Moscow. Yeah, they were controlled by Moscow, but it was also representing its sovereignty. Well, that wouldn't happen until 1991. They weren't representing early on, but there were leaks. Like I said, the first time I ever heard about the Ukrainian KGB was in 1986 when they were doing all that stuff in Ukraine, and that information got leaked, and yeah. When the Ukrainian KGB existed in 1954 to 1991, it was designed as a Soviet security organ serving the interests of the USSR, embedded in Ukrainian territory and administration. So this is looking at it from the perspective of the Soviet Union, seeing it as it's not a continuity of the Soviet Union, but it is a continuity of whatever plans and ideas and designs they had for the original KGB of Ukraine. However, when the USSR collapsed, Ukraine already had UN recognition, defined borders, administrative structures, a separate political identity. but it didn't have independence, and the Ukrainian people didn't have any knowledge of independence either. And the KGB, of course, could exploit and manipulate that as well. Because what does it mean to be independent? Well, let's fight for independence like America fought for independence. See, that's another connection. It's for us to see and not understand what's actually going on. So when the SBU was formed in 1991, it did not emerge from nowhere. It was built from Soviet infrastructure, Ukrainian institutional continuity, existing international legitimacy. But this does not prove that the Soviet system deliberately planned for a future Soviet Ukraine with its own independent intelligence service. It doesn't prove that. But wouldn't it be crazy if it did? But what if I was right about this? We're definitely in trouble. Like I said. What do you guys? Don't post in the comments. But what do you guys think in your mind? The Soviet structure created the conditions that Ukraine's sovereignty possible and viable when the moment arrived. See, here's the thing. That's how the West thinks. The West thinks in conditions. They think, oh, well, this led to this. They think in unpredictable terms. It just created people say, well, that's well grounded. That things would be, without proof, we couldn't prove it. But for KGB, they did a lot of mind trickery, the propaganda and everything. They really knew how people's minds worked. And they made it look like there were conditions involved, when really that was a plan all the time. That's how they thought. Because that's how I think. So the precise answer is the SBU is a product of continuity from Soviet-era Ukrainian structures. Because people would say, well, it was forced to do that because it was gained independence in 1991. But if it was already sovereign in the UN, then that suggests a continuity, and the KGB knows that transition, and they fill in that gap. It was not officially designed as a future sovereign intelligence service of Soviet planners. Soviet, the communists, the Bolsheviks, sure, not designed, but from a leaving ideology and knowing that ideology would collapse a country, and that would be the basis of independence from ideologies in general. I could see that happening. Ukraine's UN status made such a transformation feasible and legally smooth. It reduced to one accurate word, potential, even more precisely, latent. Latent means... That's difficult. I know what it is, it's latent means of quality or state existing but not yet developed or manifest, hidden or concealed. Latent. I mean, that's pretty much what I said. Latent. It's hidden and concealed. See, it sometimes speaks in as double talk as well. Like, I didn't say. I wasn't the one who said. I didn't tell ChatGPT this. I didn't say a future Soviet Ukraine with its own independent intelligence service. I mean, you could draw it from that. But I didn't directly say that. But it kind of did say it with latent and hidden and concealed. Yeah, you can't measure it. You can't measure anything that's latent. It has to be revealed, like latent heat. It's heat exists, but you can't measure it. You can see how it's. You can. Okay, we're gonna have to go in. we're gonna have to get a context in this. Present but not yet activated or visible. Present but not yet activated or visible. Exactly. This is how the Eastern Europe thinks. It's always present. Things are always present, not activated or visible. Like consciousness is not. It's present but not yet activated or visible. Superweapon present but not activated or visible. CIA would say that. It all goes together. So when we say the Ukrainian security structure had a latent potential for sovereignty, it means the framework already existed, the capacity was already there, the possibility was embedded in the system, but it was dormant until 1991 made it real. And no one knew what that meant until 1991 actually came about, and 1994 happened with the Russian nukes being transferred to Russia. I believe they were destroyed. It was actually witnessed by the IAEA. The structure for the SBU was already inside the Soviet system, even though it was not yet allowed to exist as an independent Ukrainian agency. One word transition right here, dormant, or even simpler, sleeping. Exactly what I've been saying. Let's go into, I want to go into the, what was the Budapest Memorandum? Budapest was a 1994 international agreement about Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But you can tell by the description I gave before. Let me open my notes and reread that list. So I wrote, a weapon that is self-correcting, that's not a nuke, autonomous, not a nuke inherently, changes states, kind of could, two entities involved, which two entities could mean East and West, U.S. and Russia, could also be two operators that operate this super weapon, which could also be East and West, but it's a honeypot. That would be a honeypot in that case, that scenario, for the agency. Which means that the super weapon itself is a honeypot for something to have an operator. So it needs two operators. So it can't just be one. If it was a person, it couldn't be just be one person. It has to be two people. So it has to go down the list. It has to be two people. If it was people involved, it cannot be stolen or replicated. You cannot steal the SBU. It cannot be replicated in the United States. It's not the CIA. CIA cannot be it. It's unable to be used by a nation, which means that it's higher than a nation. Unlike the CIA, which operates under United States perception, the CIA could technically be used by the nation, but SBU controls the nation. People always call it a deep state nation. Which you could say it's illegitimate, but also legitimate in the eyes of the Western world. So both are true. It's interesting. It's untraceable. Putin has said that there were nukes that he had that were untraceable. If you call the SBU part of the KGB as an untraceable nuclear weapon, it's not a nuke. A nuke has radiation. It has, that's a changing of states, but Ukraine changes state. KGB, SBU changes state. It was self-creating. The KGB was self-creating. Ukrainian KGB was self-creating because it's sovereign. So self-creating. Superweapon was also self-creating because you could just speak out its specs and your perception would think, oh, that's a weapon. So in your mind it would create itself. And it says it can hide itself. Which would be military grade stuff. Yet it calls independent after effects. Which would be like radiation. That would be, like I said, independent after effects in this case would be in 2014, where people would blame the CIA and not look at the SBU, or they blame Putin and not the SBU. They blame everyone but the SBU. So we could think of this as a person as well. A person that is self-correcting, or two people. A person that is autonomous. A person that changes states. A person that is part of another entity. A person that cannot be stolen or replicated. A person who is unable to be used by a nation. A person who is untraceable. A person who is self-creating. A self-created person, or self-created consciousness. You could see this as consciousness as well. Self-correcting consciousness, autonomous consciousness, change of states consciousness, two entities involved consciousness, cannot be stolen or replicated consciousness, unable to be used by nations consciousness, untraceable consciousness, self-creating consciousness, and it cannot itself consciousness, yet cause independent act defense consciousness. But you can also say that about a person with a consciousness, self-creating, and it can hide itself. The consciousness hides behind the person. The person is just a mask, yet it causes independent after effects based on how they interact with their environment and their world and their realities and other people's realities and perceptions. So that sounds like a civil weapon to me. The CIA never figured out what it was. There was many of them that could be many things. They just saw the outline of something that appeared in words, but they could not assume anything. Because that's not how the Western world works. They do not assume. Trust but verify, they say. But it had a structure of a weapon. And this was the Cold War. And whether it... No. Did they know what was going to happen in the future? I don't know. Did they think it was going to be a person that would... or two people were going to be involved? I don't know. I think that would be too close to them to figure out. But if something was speaking in that perspective that they could understand, then they would think that's what this is all about. And they didn't know what they were part of. It was like, how is that possible that something that existed after we did be able to understand us better than we understand, that understands as much as we understand ourselves? But again, like I said, that would only be senior members, and Putin is the oldest one there. Well, one of the oldest, but he's definitely has his eyes on the situation. Sorry about that, I just hit my mic. So, anyways, let's continue reading this. Ukraine inherited the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, and in exchange for surrendering it, major powers promised to respect and protect Ukraine. It didn't need protecting and respecting. They were in trouble. Not Ukraine. They were in trouble. The major powers that promised to protect them, they were the ones in trouble. Signed in 1994 by Ukraine, United States, United Kingdom, and Russia. And SPU doesn't even care about the United Kingdom because that's EU. Ukraine, United States. Also, they wouldn't care about it's also kind of also a religious thing too. Going back maybe to its KGB roots. They're atheists, and United Kingdom had Europe had that and they would use this against you for blackmail or whatever. The KGB, they would say, well, Russia is, well, even Ukraine would say they're Orthodox Christians. Separation of church and state, though. Or so they say. That's paper too. United Kingdom, that would be part of Europe. That would be your Catholic. Can't ever pronounce this word. Catholicism, and Protestant, which were against each other. And Orthodox Christianity sees them pretty much as clowns, nonsensical. because they know what their ancestry is. And then, of course, there's Russia, son by Russia. So all of these are Christian nations. Well, United States is kind of like tries to. It has so many different denominations, but Ukraine and Russia definitely sandwiched the two together. What Ukraine received in return: guarantees of its sovereignty and borders. It didn't need this. It had the KGB. Promises of non-aggression. That's what it says. That's not something I would have said. Promises of non-aggression. Assurances of no economic or military coercion. Now that's an interesting thing. What do you mean by no economic or military coercion? See, based on what this says, it sounds like someone didn't get the memo of what that superweapon was. Guarantees of its sovereignty, the SBU, the Ukrainian SBU KGB, already guaranteed that. Someone flopped on the memorandum. A lot of flops were made. And it's worse than what you see because people said, well, the nukes give them away instead of being able to protect themselves. That's what killed them. But that's not, they couldn't use them anyways. So it was useless. It wasn't going to protect them, even if they had them. It was just an exchange, a handoff that didn't mean anything. Right? Promises of non-aggression. I guess that was an add-in. Assurances of no economic or military coercion. Who wrote that in? Some of this doesn't even make any sense. Like coercion, that would be like a bribe or forcing them to be on either side of economic. I mean, true, but then you had NATO, but NATO was never part of Ukraine, and it was never going to be part of Ukraine. I could see that's a double dealing thing right there. Yeah, it sounds like, what it sounds like to me here is, this was written in during the KGB time, and this was written where they knew that the CIA in the West would never find out what was going on, and they wrote this to make them think that, oh, well, Ukraine is getting independence. And it made it sound like that. And that's what they believed, I think. Ukraine agreed to transfer its nuclear weapons to Russia, but they belonged to Russia, we saw that, and joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, as a non-nuclear state. Fun fact, guys, China never signed that. Never signed a non-nuclear state. Especially with Russia, they never did that. In essence, Ukraine traded nuclear power for promises of security, promises that were later violated when Russia invaded Ukraine. If you want more symbolically, guarantee. One more critically, betrayal. Or was it really betrayal? Maybe betrayal to our perception, but not from the top layer. Betrayal to the... Well, it wasn't even betrayal to the CIA. They just didn't catch on. I mean, that's what it was back in the day. They didn't know what game they were playing in. That's what I can see. But, yeah, guys, it's been almost an hour and 30 minutes. This was a long one, but there was a lot we needed to talk about. And this is basically all I have on this. I thought about it, you know, like I said, someone asked, I was like talking to someone, I was like, but it begs the question if that's true, if that was always prepared, if it was always prepared that way. But see, I didn't know that because at the time when I said that, I only knew about the Ukrainian KGB by Ukraine. I didn't know they existed, how long they had existed, or their whereabouts. I didn't know about their Belarusian KGB. I just found that out through ChatGPT and Google. So yeah, so I was able to put all this together, and I think it holds up. Honestly, um, so guys, you think that there is a super weapon that the CIA does not know? They've never talked about, and they were expecting the nukes to actually be the super weapon 3000, which made the world believe that it was. I didn't define this. I told you what it meant, but I didn't show what it actually does. The International Atomic Energy Agency is the world's leading center for cooperation in the peaceful use of nuclear technology, working to promote nuclear safety, security, and science. So when they brought these guys in to witness it, they monitored the destruction of the nukes. They were watching everything. There were oversight. There was oversight and everything. So to the whole entire world, they saw that these nukes were being destroyed, and nukes were the only thing. I mean, the CIA can't just say, "Well, there's a super weapon," and they say, "Well, what proof do you have?" I mean, that could be anything. There's no definite proof. There's no thing. People would say the same thing watching this video. They'd say, "Well, you don't have no proof of no super weapon." But I tell you that the framework is there. The outline is there. The shadow around the circle is there. It operates under the night. There it is. I didn't know that either. It operates under the United Nations system and is tasked with verifying that member states comply with their commitments to use nuclear material and facilities for peaceful purpose. That sounds to me that this whole memorandum thing for the nukes was give Russia to Ukraine at the time they get independence, hand them over back to Russia because you're part of the United Nations. If they're expecting weapons, just give them the nukes, and you're part of the UN. You don't lose anything. You couldn't use them anyways. CIA has its tail between its legs and can't say, "Well, we think there's a super weapon." Couldn't prove it. But this was shown to the world, and people believed this instead. Games that KGB plays. A role established in 1957 in response to the development of nuclear technology. Not to mention that Ukraine is part of the United Nations as a founding member. So is Russia. What? No, wait. Soviet Union. Sorry, I didn't mean to say Russia. Russia was not part of that. But Soviet Union was. Which you could say was Moscow. The IAEA also uses nuclear science and technology to help member states address socioeconomic and environmental challenges and works to prevent nuclear terrorism. And the CIA is like, there is a weapon way worse than nuclear war, and we just got screwed. Yep. Peaceful use of nuclear technology. See, and this is all about nukes. They think that World War III is about nukes. It is about nukes, but we're also in. We're kind of being played by a Cold War right now, as far as narratives go. And I'm the only one that's ever talked about this. That I've never heard anything like what I've presented here. But yeah, that's what the IA is. It's about nukes. So it sounded like the KGB knew that there was going to be nukes, and that was going to be the talk of the. They even had propaganda for nukes, and all that running. So they really were thinking beyond nukes at the time of the Cold War. The United States wasn't. They actually dropped it. You know the story. Russia didn't do that, but there was. So yeah, they were ahead of they're ahead of us on this one. But yeah, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. This was a long one. It's 1 minute, 30 minutes, and 59 seconds. Well, just hit 1 minute. I mean, 1 hour and 30 minutes. It's 2:13 a.m. in the morning right now for me on Thanksgiving. And I'm ready to go to bed. Oh my. That was a lot. And I've been up doing, how long has it been now? Like 3 hours doing videos straight. So yeah, I'll end it here. I told you everything I needed to tell you. I showed you my notes. Part of that was in my archive. I did. I'll admit that was partially read from my archive. It was in my notes though. It wasn't in something in my personal archives that I couldn't search for. I just knew that was in my notes. That's why. I should have done that before because a lot of my stuff, well, 99, all of my stuff that I write, it becomes in archives, is in my notes. Yeah. Okay, I see. I had it under a different thing. Yeah. It's okay. I see reconstruction now. Yeah. I should have looked at it. I didn't think about using my notes. Um. So yeah, guys. I'll end it here, and you can think about stuff I've talked about here. You've taken notes. I know that a lot of people. This is a lot for a lot of people to handle, and wrap their minds around. You might have to watch this several times in a row to get it, understand. Some people will immediately get it. Others will probably never get it. But there's always going to be different. Always going to be the everybody gets something out of this. Um, so yeah, I see you guys in the next video. Uh, Bye for now. Uh, See you in the next one. Although I will say this, I don't think I'll make another one of these because I think I've talked about everything I needed to. I don't think there's anything I need to add as a bonus. So let me go check, see which one video I'm currently on. This is part 5. So yeah, I don't think I'll be making a part 6. So yeah, I'll see you guys later.